Hi, this is Mac from Mac's List. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about my new book, Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. I've been helping job seekers find meaningful, well-paying work since 2001, and now I put all my best advice into one easy-to-use guide. My book shows you how to make your resume stand out in a stack of applications, where you can find the hidden jobs that never get posted, and what you need to do to ace your next job interview. Get the first chapter now for free. Visit maxlist.org/anywhere. This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm Mac Pritchard, your host and publisher of Mac's List. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Ben Forstag, Becky Thomas, and Jessica Black. This week, we're talking about job search strategies for older workers. Age discrimination is illegal in the United States, and research shows it happens frequently in hiring. You may have experienced it yourself. Our guest expert this week is Jacob Scher. He says older workers need to use different strategies in a job search. Jacob and I talk in the second half of the show. To make the best case for a salary offer or a raise, you need to know what other employers pay. Ben has found a website that gives you great information about company salaries and office cultures. He tells us more in a moment. How do you avoid getting pigeonholed at your company? That's our question of the week. It comes from Michelle Stevens in Portland, Oregon. Becky offers her advice shortly. Well, this week, we're talking about job search strategies for older workers. The four of us are out there in the community a lot, and I'd like to hear, what kind of concerns do you hear when you speak to job seekers and employers about this subject? Ben?
So it's a question and a concern that comes up a lot from job seekers. I'd say it's probably in the top 3 or 4 questions we get from people who write us. People saying, like, I think the problem I'm having with my job search is age discrimination or ageism or, whatever term you want to wrap around that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think it is tough for older job seekers to find a job. When I talk to employers, probably rightfully so, not many employers talk about this because they don't want to get in trouble for seeming like they're discriminating against older workers. But when they do bring it up, often it's under the context of they're actually looking for older workers in terms of fleshing out their diversity of their staff. They want kind of more perspectives, more different kinds of people working there. And under the rubric of diversity, they put age diversity in there as well. So they're coming from it from what I would say is a positive perspective. That being said, there's a lot of employers who probably don't talk about this because they have a more negative view of older candidates.
Yeah, and I do hear from employers as well who see experience as an asset, not a liability. How about you, Becky? What do you hear when you're talking with?
As far as concerns from job seekers, I think one of them, when you're older and you've got a lot of experience, but you may be unemployed at the moment or you've been laid off or some sort of transition older, like when you're like longer into your career, the biggest concern is probably just like, I probably am too expensive for some of these companies. They have salary expectations because they've been experienced, they've been working and they should get a higher salary. But I think a lot of times there's a perception of they can get younger, cheaper work, and they're not going to hire me because I have experience, sort of thing. And that's a legitimate concern. I think that's something that is happening.
Yeah, and I think kind of coming off of what you're just saying about that is that I hear a lot from older workers who actually don't have the expectation of a certain salary, but the employers don't consider them because of that salary expectation that's just because of their experience. So is that making sense?
So like they just assume that an older worker would ask for more?
Right. So the job seeker would work for less and just wants a job, just wants to be hired, but they're not able to get through the queue because employers see all of their experience and how senior they've been and make that assumption for them.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
And I think this speaks to a bigger trend that we've talked about on the show, and I'm sure Jacob will talk about as well, is that it's not the age per se of the candidate. It's what the age might mean in the employer's mind. So, everyone comes up with stereotypes of what people act like. And I think a lot of employers, the stereotype, right or wrong, of older employers is they're more expensive, or they might not work as well with younger managers, or they're not as up to date with technology. So one of the things that I know we tell older workers is, like, if you feel like this is a challenge in your career, work to overcome those stereotypes. Like, show people that you're really good with technology, or that highlight examples of when you had a younger manager and so forth. This is a cliche, but it's totally true. It's you're only as old as you act.
Right. And I know Jacob will want to talk about this as well, that there are these common concerns employers have that they may not say out loud, but if you can identify them and address them both in your cover letter, your application materials, and interviews, you can help overcome those barriers. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation because it's a topic that I find comes up frequently in our surveys and the comments we get. But let's turn to you first, Ben, because you're out there every week poking around the internet looking for resources, books, tools that our listeners can use in a job search or their career. So what have you found for us this week?
This week I want to talk about a website I recently found. It's called Comparably, and it's available at comparably.com. This is one of those like tech startups with a weird name. So it's comparably.com. So
some naming consultant got paid a lot of money to put this one together.
That, or they were looking for an available URL. So this is basically an alternative to Glassdoor and Salary.com. It's a tool to help you find, salary ranges by job title, salary ranges by your location, and salary ranges by employer. The thing I really like about this is, it works kind of like Glassdoor and Salary.com, where the data they collect is whatever they can find publicly available and whatever people are willing to share with the website. It does a fine job with the salary stuff, but what they really do well on is figuring out the office culture inside an organization. And we get questions a lot from folks saying, we know that office culture is important to the employer, and that's one of their key hiring factors when they're making the decision, like who's going to fit into this office culture. How on earth do I find out about the office culture before I'm actually in the office? And so this is a great website to figure out what's going on inside those offices. Are people happy? What values are important? How are they treating people? What is the work life like? What does the work life balance look like? Things like that. And the way they do this, I'm not sure where they're getting all their information, but they have this giant survey of questions that they push out to people, and they encourage people to fill out surveys about their own experience. But they ask all these really interesting questions that I thought were insightful about office culture. So they ask questions like, are you challenged at work? Or if you were the boss, what's the first thing you'd change? Or how secure do you feel in your job at your company? Or what percentage of the time are you bored at work? Or like this one, would you leave your current job for a 20% raise at a different company? It's not just asking what is the culture at your company, which is going to get a very canned response. It's asking questions that their algorithm can kind of figure out what is the work life there look like. So I thought it was a really good site. There's a lot of data. They visualize the data very interestingly. Lots of graphs. If you're a stat person like me, you'll probably love it. But if you're looking for information about the inside workings of organizations, you'll probably love it too. It's comparably.com.
Okay, we'll be sure to include that in the show notes. And any tips about how people might use information like that in either an application, Ben, or in an interview? Because it's good to know if you want to be inside an organization, but how can you leverage that information when you're chasing a job?
So I think there's two ways. First is use it as kind of a filter. If you want a specific type of work-life experience, for whatever reason, you want to get home by a certain hour to put your kids to bed, or you want the free company lunch, or you want a group teamwork environment versus everyone sits in their own cubicle environment. This might be a good way to kind of figure that out before you even apply for a job, just to save yourself some time and energy. The other way you could use this, I think, is right before the interview, where this gives you a sense of what's really important inside the organization outside of what they write on their website or push out through press releases. And it might give you just the right framework to think about how you approach that hiring manager and how you talk about your interest in the company. The challenge with interviews is showing how you'll fit in, and you kind of need to know what the original context looks like before you can place yourself in that organization.
Good tips and a good resource. Well, thanks, Ben. And if you've got a suggestion for Ben, he would love to hear from you. His address is easy to remember. It's ben@maxlist.org. And we'd love to share your idea on the show. Now, let's turn to you, our listeners, and Becky is here to answer one of your questions. So what's in the mailbag this week, Becky?
This week we have a question that came via email from Michelle Stevens in Portland, Oregon. So I'm just going to read it. I'm about 7 years into my career and I don't have a, quote, dream job, but I've always taken jobs with the goal of moving up the ladder of the organization. I have done that fairly well, but I've been feeling like I'm beginning to get pigeonholed into roles that I do well, but don't want to remain in. How can I showcase the skills I really want to utilize while also continuing to do well in the current position I'm in? This is a great question, Michelle. I think that a lot of people feel this way where they're in a certain culture, they're in a certain environment, and they sort of get assigned the jobs that people know they can do and just keep doing that. And you can definitely start to feel stagnant and feel like you're not actually like growing in your career or really utilizing sort of the things that you want to do. As far as your question, I think it depends on the company you're at. I feel like if there's room at the existing organization that you're in and you're happy there and you want to stay there, there's a couple things that you can do. The first thing I thought of was to really look at the organization, take a look at the different departments, different jobs that people are doing, and see the ones that are utilizing the skills that you want to build, and then develop relationships with those colleagues. Talk to them, sort of find out what they're working on, see if you can help. And just sort of like, even if it's just like a small part of a project that you may not have worked on, I think that people appreciate volunteers and people who are excited about the work that they're doing. And just let them know that, you're looking to use those skills more and open up to them a little bit and see if they're willing to work with you and give you some advice. And just sort of working with those folks to sort of start to develop those skills a little bit more in your existing office. And there may be a role that you're looking at within the company that would fit more with the skills and you would be excited to move into. Once you have those relationships with your colleagues, they'd be much more likely to think of you for that role, and you can sort of move into a more challenging, exciting role for yourself. So that's the advice that I would have.
I would also just say informational interviews. I think those are always great. We talk about that a lot here. But being able to, again, if you can identify what types of work you're interested in moving into, being able to find other organizations that are similar to your organization. We have a small office here, that Michelle may also be in a small environment that doesn't have other departments to sort of work in. But if you can identify some other organizations that could be similar or that do have other departments, and you can do some informational interviews to see what the best opportunities are to move into roles like that within the small organization. So good luck, Michelle.
I'd just add that this is going to not come out clearly, I don't think, but passion is a skill and passion is a resource. It's not always the easiest skill or resource to show or quantify when you're talking about a new employer. But when you're talking about a known commodity, someone who you already work for, I think if you can really show that, like, I'm passionate about this project over here, even if I'm not the most technically skilled at it, but I'm passionate about learning about that. That's an asset that I think a lot of employers value, and it will help you transition over to the things you want to do if you can show that like you're really earnest about wanting to learn more and help out in any way possible. And so I would say, like, if there is something in your existing organization that you want to be doing, don't be afraid of showing that you're really interested in that. And that's going to kind of grease the wheels for getting you over to that project.
And I would just add to the excellent advice Becky and Jessica in particular have shared about being clear about what you want and figuring out a path to get there. Don't get discouraged when you hear someone say, and you will, if you do those things, I never thought of you in that way. And that's a good sign that you're going in a different direction. And you might get discouraged when you hear that, but it actually should energize you because it's signaling that you're clear about what you want and how you might do it and the path to get there. So good luck with that, Michelle, and let us know how it goes. Well, terrific. Well, thank you, Michelle and Becky. And if you've got a question for Becky, you can email her, just like Michelle, at becky@maxlist.org or call the listener line. That number is 716-JOB-TALK. That's 716-562-8255. And if we use your question on the show, we'll send you a copy of Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. And we're dropping Michelle's copy in the mail this week. We'll be back in a moment, and when we return, I'll talk with our guest, expert this week, Jacob Scher, about job search strategies for older workers. Most people struggle with job hunting. The reason is simple. Most of us learn the nuts and bolts of looking for work by trial and error. That's why I produce this podcast, to help you master the skills you need to find a great job. It's also why I wrote my new book, Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. For 15 years at Max List, I've helped people in Portland, Oregon find meaningful, well-paying, and rewarding jobs that they love. Now, I put all of my job hunting secrets in one book that can help you no matter where you live. You'll learn how to get clear about your career goals, find hidden jobs that never get posted, and ace your next job interview. For more information and to download the first chapter for free, visit maxlist.org/anywhere. Now let's turn to this week's guest expert, Jacob Scher. Jacob Scher is the founder of Job Mob, an award-winning blog that serves a global audience. His site offers straight-talking advice based on Jacob's own experiences finding jobs in the United States, Canada, France, and Israel. He joins us today from Ashdod, Israel. Jacob, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Our topic this week is job search strategies for older workers. Now, let's start by talking about age discrimination in hiring. It's a real problem, isn't it, Jacob?
It's arguably the thing that people reach out to me the most when it comes to older job seekers is how to handle the ageism issue. It's almost like I read the book Catch-22 a few years ago. A lot of people have read that book. It's a big bestseller, obviously Joseph Heller. Yeah. And there's the famous line, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you.
Yeah.
But
I think that's Milo Bender who has that line, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, I love that book.
So, yeah, it's a great book, and I actually came upon it a lot later than I should have. But I'm sure that a lot of people have read it, and it's a school book that people had to read at some point. And so, on the one hand, not every rejection is going to be because of ageism, but on the other hand, ageism is a very real thing. You have to recognize that it exists, and you have to deal with it and plan accordingly. So, one thing that people need to understand about ageism is that it comes down to what we call cultural fit. It's a really frustrating thing that you come for a job and you have a lot of experience and you're clearly qualified and have had a lot of successes in your history, but you come to an interview and it doesn't work, and you don't even understand why. They may even tell you that you were a great candidate. I had someone reach out to me. This is a person. I'm not using her real name. Her name is, I'll call her Mary. A fantastic teacher, 15 years of experience, won awards. And she said that at some point it just became that she couldn't she couldn't get appreciated by the people that the schools that she was approaching, because they were looking for someone who was younger. It was as simple as that, and she didn't understand why. But when I spoke with her a little bit further, it turns out that it was a perfect match to what we call cultural fit issues. So there was actually a professor. Her name is Lauren Rivera. She did a survey that led to research as part of research in December 2012. I think that it was published in the American Sociological Review. And it was called Hiring as Cultural Matching, the Case of Elite Professional Service Firms. And what she basically found out was that it all comes down to cultural fit. Cultural fit, it's not about qualifications, they're not always the most important deciding factor of hiring companies. It's cultural fit. One thing, and this leads to a story that I myself was a part of. When I was working at a company as a manager a few years ago, so we had a recruitment process where we need to hire a developer, a programmer. And this had nothing to do with a level of experience. We were actually looking for someone who didn't have a lot of experience. But the reason I'm telling this story is we came down to having two candidates who basically had identical qualifications. And when we had to decide, we just chose the person that we thought we would enjoy spending time more with. Because when you are working with someone so closely, you're spending hours a day with them. And sure, once they've reached a certain baseline qualifications that you've put out for the job, then it really becomes more about, do you actually want to spend time with them? Do you want to work with them? Is this someone that you would enjoy being with? And so this is one of the challenges for people who come across age-based discrimination, is that they're dealing with most people that are part of the hiring process are younger than they are. And it's not always obvious to those people that these older job seekers would be a good fit in their companies or in their organizations.
So that's the problem, Jacob. Now, how do you see older workers address that concern? What can they do to demonstrate that it is indeed a good cultural fit, or are there other strategies they should follow?
Well, one thing you definitely should not do is just pretend it doesn't exist. Again, you're just gonna keep hitting a glass wall, and you're not going to understand why. So you really do need to realize that, yes, this is something that you're going to come across. It's frustrating. It sucks. It's the reality. Now, if you actually come across it directly, in other words, someone says to you point blank, "We're not going to hire you because you're X years old, or you're just too old for this position," that's a bit of a special case. That rarely ever happens, and then you kind of have to decide if you want to take it further, and you can actually sue and so forth. That's I don't want to get into that right now. That doesn't usually happen, and it's very difficult to prove, even if especially because it's often a one-on-one conversation. But in general, recruiters are not going to come out and say it to you. They might say it in different ways. They might talk about how you're overqualified, and we'll get into that. But if you do feel that there is something there and you are getting pushback because of your age, well, then you've basically applied to the wrong place. And you can't always know that in advance. And so that's unfortunate. But there are times where you can know that in advance. And so one thing you absolutely should do, and here's an action tip, is that you absolutely should be looking for companies who have a history of hiring people like you.
So now, that means a lot of. How do you find those folks, Jacob? How do you find companies like that?
So a simple tip is LinkedIn. You can go on LinkedIn. You can search for companies. You can search for people who have had the same background as you, whether it's companies that you worked for, even the positions that you held, whether it's the same academic background you have, even if it goes back 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. You can find people like yourself, and you can see where they're working now. Wherever they're working now, those companies have proven by hiring these people that they hire people like you. And so it's actually a double whammy, because on the one hand, you can reach out to those people knowing that they've already been hired there, so the company has proven what it can do. But because you have so much in common with that person, they're more likely to respond to you if you ask them for for example, how they managed to get into that company. They're likely to respond because people tend to identify with people like them.
Okay.
As opposed to just reaching out to someone who has nothing in common with you.
So let's talk about that's a great tip. And let's talk about some other concerns that employers might have about older workers. I know, looking at your blog and other content you've created, you mentioned salary, experience. You've talked about cultural fit and how to overcome that. What are some of those top concerns, Jacob, that employers might have about older workers, and how do you see people successfully address those concerns, either in application materials or in interviews or in networking as they're out there looking for work?
Okay, so it's a good question, because if you understand what an employer is concerned about and you address it, you're more likely to overcome those concerns as an obstacle. And so a number of there are fair concerns and there are unfair concerns. And again, ageism exists. That's the reality. But in terms of fair concerns, people who have more experience, they tend to merit a higher salary, perhaps more responsibility. And that makes sense. Now, not every company has budgeted for that higher pay or that higher level position. And so if you do company research up front, you'll discover that they're not looking for someone like you, and you shouldn't apply there. Another concern, if you come across a company that maybe you're wondering if they might consider you to be overqualified, is they might think that you may be unwilling to do tasks that are beneath you, more junior level tasks. You may not be willing to work with a boss who is so much younger than you are. Perhaps you'll get bored in a position because it doesn't fully take into account all the skills that you bring to the table. You might, your manager or your potential managers or your supervisors, they may see you as a potential threat eventually if you are actually more skilled than they are. So these are all things that are very legitimate. Well, not the last one, not as much, but most the earlier ones are more legitimate concerns, and you can address them. So, for example, if a company is concerned about keeping you long enough, that's something that they can be concerned about for any employee. They have no way of knowing how long someone's going to stay on board. And so when they ask you the typical question of what you see yourself in a few years or in 5 years, whatever it is, well, then you have to be careful and measured in your answer, that you understand the role, and you're looking to you want to get a better understanding of what your responsibilities will be, and you want to grow with the company, and you may have a history where you've been loyal to previous companies, and so there's no reason why it'd be any different here. And so you can assuage concerns that way. If you talk about dealing with younger managers, well, the older you get, you've almost all of your managers at some point have probably been younger than you are, or most of them anyway. And so it's easy to bring up stories where you worked with your managers successfully and there was never an issue regarding their age or your age. And so that's usually an easy one to get around. In terms of being an internal competitor, that's a bit of a toss-up, because that means you have to understand the manager's personality. That's not information that's so easy to get up front, unless perhaps you've spoken to a former colleague of that manager or a former employee of that manager. You might even want to stay away from working with someone like that altogether, which is something that, again, if you've done company research up front, you can avoid that kind of thing.
And so, do you have suggestions? I think those are great points to make in an interview, but I can imagine our listeners saying, well, gosh, I can't even get an interview. How can you signal, either through your application materials or in other ways, and make the points that you just said, so that you, in fact, get a chance to compete in the process? Any tips on that, Jacob?
Well, most of the jobs that are out there tend to go to people through referral. Okay, that's just the way it is. Again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation. People want to work with people like them, people they like, cultural fit, and so forth. And so if you do follow through with the tip that I gave earlier, using LinkedIn to find people like you, working for companies that hire people like you, if things go well in that conversation, they may say, you know what, I know that we're hiring right now, and give me your resume and I'll hand it in internally. I mean, that's a best case scenario, but it's actually not that unreasonable scenario either. One thing you can do as well is you can, if you can connect with people, and there's actually a bit of a side tip to that tip, which is that don't only look for current employees. Current employees, they may respond again because they identify with you, but ex-employees are even more likely to respond because they're no more bound. Usually they're no longer bound to the company, and so they'll feel more free speaking with you about people inside the company. If they're a recent ex-employee, then their information is more likely to be current than someone who's been out there for a long time. But even then, someone 5 years, they can still have a lot of information that will be helpful to you. And so you can ask them for their resume if they're in a position similar to what you would be looking for, and you can get an idea of what kinds of resumes get hired or get people hired at that company, and then make your resume look similar to their resume. Again, using information that has proven successful in the past.
So networking is always important in any job search, but what I'm hearing you say is it's especially important if you're an older worker.
It really is. It really is, because you're trying to prove that the company will hire people like you, and all those extra conditions that younger job seekers won't necessarily have to worry about. So yes, I would say that. I agree.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Jacob. This has been a great conversation. Now, tell us what's coming up next for you.
Well, right now, what I'd like to do is just refer people to something that I call the Midlife Job Search Report, which is kind of a best practices and tips ebook that I put out on my site, and you can get it for free by becoming what I call a Job Mob Insider. It's just a free registration on my website. I'm always putting out new reports, new exclusive resources for my members. I'm currently working on a new book. I'm working on a coaching group coaching service, and so there are a number of things coming. But right now, I'll keep it at that. Just head on over and look for that Midlife Job Search Report.
Terrific, and we'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes. And I know people can always find you on the web at jobmob.co.il. And you're also on Twitter, and your Twitter handle there is @JacobShare. Well, Jacob, thanks again for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. Again, it was an honor to be here, and you guys keep doing a great job with your Find Your Dream Job Now podcast.
Thank you, Jacob. Take care. All right, we're back in the Max List studio with the team. And what are your thoughts about my conversation with Jacob?
Okay, I'll start. So I think Jacob hit it on the nose there, where the solution is a little bit of empathy and a lot of bit of networking. So you need to kind of think through what objections could the employer have around me because of my age? And this is a practice I think everyone should be doing when they're applying for a job or interviewing. Like, think about what is the possible thing that the employer might have an issue with me but will never tell me about, and how can I proactively address that? And you can sometimes state it out loud, directly talk about it in your interview. But more often than not, it's like, what other things can I kind of wrap around my professional brand, my application, to counteract any kind of potential negative stereotypes about me? And then the other piece is, networking, which is ultimately the number one way to overcome any barrier, because whatever negative stereotypes people have about you, or have about people like you, if they meet you and know you and trust you in person, they're going to say oh, well, lots of older workers are like this, but not Mac. Because I know Mac, and Mac is tech savvy and loves working with younger people and doesn't want that much money, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, good point. Mac doesn't want that much money. Just kidding. One thing I wanted to chat with you guys, though, I've been thinking a lot about this culture fit thing, and he mentioned that as well, like the example of the teacher who was like, oh, it's not a culture fit, and then they just wanted somebody younger. Is it worth pressing that and trying to fit into a culture that may not be open to an older worker? If you are an older worker, if you should just be well, they're never going to hire me, I'll move on. Or is it worth sort of positioning yourself and being I'm young and hip and will fit into your culture, Yeah,
that's an interesting question, or a statement, I guess, because I think that there's a lot of truth in that you don't necessarily want to get into an environment that is not welcoming to you, because otherwise you're going to be miserable in that respect too, even if you love the actual job. If the team environment isn't, if there's something that's not welcoming, that's not really fun either. But I don't know what the answer is. I think that's a really good question, and probably is a case by case basis. Where certain places will have a little bit more easy ways of, if you, I don't know if the right word is blend in, or kind of adapt a little bit easier. I don't really know how that all works, but you may be able to seamlessly transition into that. In other places, it just is, you might just have to give up.
It's an important question, and I think you need to be authentic to yourself. You can't be something that you're not, and you want to work somewhere that you're going to be able to thrive. And to Jacob's point in the beginning, if someone is saying directly to you they're not going to hire you because of your age, you do have grounds for a lawsuit. And if you want to take that battle on, and it'll be a hard one. It's a good fight, but it'll be a hard one. So you need to make that choice.
The challenge here is that no employer will ever tell you that directly, right? Because they don't want to put themselves in that risky situation. And so they couch their objections into things like, it's not a good culture fit, right? Or you're overqualified, or you cost too much money. And it's you have to read between the lines a little bit. And I think one of the upsetting kind of side issues this is that it denigrates the whole idea that there is like a company culture or an internal culture that is valid, and finding the right fit is important. When an employer uses that as an excuse not to hire you, it can feel like, well, that's just made up and they just want
they just
people.
want a homogenous workforce. They want people like them. Yeah.
And that's a topic we could probably address and dedicate an entire podcast to, about what exactly are we talking about when we talk about office culture. But I mean, it is a thing, and I just wish that the conversation between employers and job seekers could be a little bit more transparent.
Yeah, I think that the bottom line is, like, for an older worker, you want to work somewhere where you're wanted and appreciated, and somewhere that is open to a diverse age range, right? So if a company is going to reject you for that sort of thing, then you probably don't want to work there anyway. And just to find the companies that are open to you. I think the LinkedIn comment, that the tip that he gave as far as like finding similar people on LinkedIn, is a good one too. So, yeah.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Jacob, for joining us this week, and thank you, our listeners, for downloading today's episode of Find Your Dream Job. If you like what you hear, please sign up for our free weekly newsletter. In every issue, we give you the key points of that week's show, and we also include links to all the resources mentioned, and you get a transcript of the full episode. If you subscribe to the newsletter now, we'll send you our job seeker checklist. In one easy-to-use file, we show you all the steps you need to take to find a great job. Get your free newsletter and checklist today. Go to maxlist.org/podcast. And join us next Wednesday when our special guest will be Katrina Coyer. She'll explain how to take control of your job search. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job.